Hello, and welcome back to the Science of Fallout series. Today we are talking about the geckos, which is the kind of less terrifying reptile of the Fallout world. Geckos are only encountered on the west coast, appearing in Fallout 2, which does also include a town called Gecko, and in Fallout New Vegas, and they are one of the earliest enemies that you'll encounter in Fallout New Vegas. There's no confirmed species that the geckos originated from in Fallout. There's a wide range of reptiles living in the southwestern United States, especially around the Mojave Desert. So the most likely candidate I can find is the western banded gecko, Coleonyx variegatus. They are found in the Mojave Desert, and there's 5 subspecies recognised. So they are a member of the Blepharidae family of geckos. I'm sorry, I butchered that pronunciation. But the name comes from the Greek eu meaning good and blepharos, which means eyelid. So that's why if you have an infection in your eyelids, it's called blepharitis. So blepharos is the Greek term for eyelid. So this sets this family of geckos apart from the other kind of geckos because they have eyelids that close and they don't have the sticky feet that allows them to climb up on smooth surfaces, whereas there are other species of gecko that don't have eyelids, so they use their tongues to keep their eyes from drying out, and they have the sticky feet. They can climb up glass and things, basically. So they're kind of related but separate into this family. So the western banded gecko is in the same family as the leopard gecko, which is a species that's native to the Middle East but is very popular as a pet. So I've put up an example photograph of a leopard gecko here. They are a very popular pet. I have dealt with quite a few of them in my time. So they are a nocturnal species, meaning that they're most active at night time, and they tend to eat a range of invertebrates, including baby scorpions, spiders and other insects and things. So their skin has really small scales on it, and it makes it feel quite soft and silky. Again, people expect reptiles to feel slimy or they feel rough or something like that, but that's not the case for these guys. Their skin feels quite soft. They are prey to a number of species, including larger lizards, as well as some mammals, snakes and things like that. If they're attacked, they do squeal, and they also are capable of the tail autotomy. So autotomy basically means cutting off yourself. So it's a technique that some lizards have where they basically can remove their tail. They drop their tail, and it's a ring of muscle that basically contracts and breaks off the tail, and it stops any kind of bleeding or anything. It's quite impressive. And then the tail tends to wiggle around for a bit after it's been removed from the body, which distracts the predator and allows the lizard to get away. So these kinds of geckos are capable of doing that. If it happens, they can regrow the tail, but it doesn't tend to have the same vibrant colours, and it does mean that it's not necessarily possible for them to do it again if they're attacked again in the future. But it is something to be aware of if you're dealing with any of these kinds of species, any lizards that can do that. It can be quite startling to see. Let's take a look at the geckos that we can encounter in Fallout New Vegas. So they're one of the first enemies that you can encounter if you do the tutorial quest with Sunny Smiles. Because she spends a lot of her time chasing the geckos away from the water sources near Goodsprings, and they're the standard variety and the weakest ones. They're treated as pests rather than anything dangerous. You know, when you compare that to going up to Sloan and they talk about the death clause and how if you go that way you're going to die. But the geckos around Goodsprings are just, it's just like a pest that the people have to deal with. So early on you will encounter the young ones and the hunter varieties, which are a wee bit stronger. They usually show up in groups, but they might not always be hostile unless you get too close to them. They've obviously grown a bit in size and they're much, much bigger than the kind of lizards that you would expect to find in the area in the real world. Coming in at about the height of a child in the game, really. They can run fast, and they do tend to run straight at you with their mouths wide open and their frills up, and mainly they attack by biting. So You know, they'll usually lunge and try and bite and things. They do lay eggs, making them oviparous, just like their origin species. And the belief is that they've mutated from FEV exposure as well as radiation, which originates around the West Tech facility. They're encountered in Fallout 2 as well before they make a return in Fallout New Vegas. You've got to assume that they're probably fine about radiation because they do tend to be found around radioactive areas. So if you venture into Clark Field, which is radioactive, you'll find golden geckos, and the Cottonwood Crater, where golden geckos tend to congregate as well. Right next to the Cottonwood crater, there's a cave called the Fireroot Cavern, and it has an exit out into Cottonwood Crater, and that's where that cave is full of radioactive water, fire geckos, and that's the location of the legendary fire gecko as well. So they do congregate around these areas where it's radioactive. So the golden geckos have a unique colouring which actually matches the coloration of the western banded gecko, with the bands, the darker bands on their backs, and the kind of yellow coloration, the golden coloration. But the golden geckos are tougher than the standard ones, and I say they do tend to be found in areas where there's a lot of radiation about. You will also find young ones and hunter golden geckos, which have adjusted stats. Again, they tend to be in groups, and you'll generally find a few of them together until they see you and all charge at you at once. They tend to do. The next one is the fire geckos. So these are the most dangerous variant, and you can find them in quite a few places. So they have similar coloration to the standard geckos, although I think it's a bit more intense. The colour, the kind of bluey purples are a bit more intense, and they also have pronounced spines down their backs and on their kind of eyebrow area, basically above their eyes. And then obviously the name comes from the fact that they've also evolved the ability to breathe fire. But like with fire ants, we don't really know exactly how they've acquired that ability. Interestingly, you do encounter them in the caves underneath Vault 19, which is obviously part of the quest that you do in Vault 19, Why Can't We Be Friends? And the caves have a lot of sulphur. There's a big sulphur deposit there, which is why the powder gangers are interested in it for, making explosives and things. It's a possibility that they're ingesting sulphur and using that somehow to create a flammable saliva, something along those lines. I say we don't really know, but that could be a possibility that, they tend to hang around near sulphur deposits, that kind of thing. And then obviously we've got Fireroot Cavern, where there's a very large population of the fire geckos, and that includes the legendary fire gecko. Like the other 4 legendary creatures, it's a lot bigger, it's a lot tougher, and a lot more powerful than the other types of geckos that you come across. And if you go in here without, turning off combat AI, you need to be prepared for a hell of a fight, because there's a lot of geckos there, and the legendary is much, much stronger and pretty dangerous. It's probably only beaten out by the legendary Deathclaw and the legendary Bloatfly in terms of strength. Be prepared if you want to do that, but obviously it's something that you might want to do for bragging rights, to take down all these legendary creatures for the fun of it. So happy hunting if you decide to try it. If you've got the Honest Hearts DLC, which takes you to Zion Canyon, sort of Utah area basically, then you can encounter the green geckos. So they look kind of similar to the golden geckos, but much more green in colour obviously, and they have the ability to spit poisonous saliva from a distance, a bit like the centaurs do. So they have a ranged attack, and you do tend to find them in groups around the waterways in Zion Canyon. The first kind of you might see is when you start the DLC and you're walking up with Follows Chalk. Yalguai appears at the top of a cliff and throws a decapitated green gecko down the hill at you. And then just after that, you do encounter a small group of young green geckos to kind of get to know them. But be aware, because the green geckos are tougher and more dangerous, and they also have a giant variety, which essentially rivals the fire gecko, the legendary fire gecko. The giant green geckos are really quite dangerous, so just something to be aware of if you do come across them. I do think that they maybe got bigger because food seems to be much more abundant in Zion Canyon. You know, there's lots and lots of plant life, lots of wildlife around. It could be that they've grown bigger because they've got more to eat and potentially more issues with predators and things like that. You've got the giant cazadors that you encounter in Zion as well, so that's kind of my theory on that. But be aware for the green geckos, the giant green geckos, because they'll make a mess of you very, very quickly if they get on top of you. It's really quite cool that they've added this. And then the final one is not one that you would normally encounter in the game. And it's something that was put in just for fun, and that is Gojira. You might know that Gojira is the Japanese name for Godzilla, so that's the Japanese pronunciation of Godzilla. And it is basically a giant fire gecko that's in the game files. You can spawn it in using console commands if you're playing on PC, and it's just called Gecko in the game, but everybody refers to it as Gojira. But the same size as a super mutant behemoth, and its stats are absolutely ridiculous. So its base DPS, damage per second, is 3,200. Its HP is sitting at 8,000, and it can kill anything, even the legendary bloatfly, legendary deathclaw, and the X-42 giant roboscorpion can't get the better of Gojira. However, if you do somehow manage to kill it, probably using God mode, then for some reason it drops General Oliver's uniform and the Blade of the East. Interestingly, it is affected by the Animal Friend perk, so if you've got that, then it won't be hostile to you. It's not really classed as cut content. This creature was never meant to be in the game. One of the developers, Seth McCaughey, basically created it for fun, to set it loose in Camp McCarran. So it is something that was just put in there as a bit of fun, which is fair enough. Yeah, but you can spawn it in, and if you really want to, you can set up battle arenas and spawn in other enemies to fight it and things. But yeah, so Gojira, you won't encounter it in a normal playthrough, but it's quite a fun little aspect, and just having the giant fire gecko is quite entertaining. So that pretty much covers the geckos that you'll encounter in the wasteland. It makes sense that you don't find them in Fallout 3 or Fallout 4, because these kind of species that they're probably based on are desert living. They wouldn't cope with the colder climate of the Atlantic coast and the northeast of the United States. It'd be too cold for them. But I do really like their design. I think it's really cool. I think it's really interesting. As a species, I do like lizards and reptiles in general. I have treated quite a few leopard geckos in my career as a vet. I've never had one drop its tail on me, but I have been bitten by one, which was quite funny. Their bite's fairly ineffectual. Their teeth are too small to really get through the skin, so there's no damage done. But it's quite funny when they're feisty and they're biting you and things and being sassy. It's quite amusing. But in the game, I think they're quite a fun enemy. They add a bit of variety to the enemies that you encounter. Something a bit different from all the raiders and, insects and things like that. I quite like having a reptilian enemy that's not going to put, the fear of God in you if you encounter it like the Deathclaws do. But something like this, and the fact that, in Goodsprings they're just considered pests and they're kind of an annoyance, kind of like cockroaches would be or rats would be potentially. It's just something that people have to kind of deal with, and it's like, I'm going to have to go and clear out the geckos from the water source again, and it's just a job that somebody has to do. So it's quite interesting, and I do quite like them. What do you think about the geckos? What do you think about their design and things? I say I really like the design. I like the coloration, and I like the kind of the spiky bits and things. I think it does make the fire geckos look more intimidating and look more interesting. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments, and obviously if you want to see more, hit the subscribe button. I do really, really appreciate all comments and all subs and things. It's really really nice that so many people are interested in kind of getting into the the lore of the Fallout series. It's something that I do love talking about and I do love learning about. So I think next week we'll maybe take a look at the mole rat, to the kind of rodent side of things. We'll see. But if you've got any thoughts about what creature you want me to cover next, then let me know as well. I'll be happy to have a look at that. And I'll see you all next time. Bye.